Greetings and welcome to our presentation on Agatha in Africa. I'm Michael Sears and I write crime fiction with Stanley Trollip under the name Michael Stanley. We're both South Africans and we write a mystery series set in Botswana featuring a detective whose nickname is Kubu. Kubu means hippopotamus in the local language, and so you can visualize his size and shape. He likes his food, but he also shares another hippo characteristic. Don't get between him and his objective. He doesn't take it well. Like almost all crime fiction writers, we owe a debt to Agatha Christie. And this shows through in our stories. In fact, Library Journal called Kubu the Hercule Poirot of the desert. The eighth Kubu mystery, A Deadly Covenant, is a prequel featuring Kubu as a young detective. It's been released in North America and will be released in December in the United Kingdom and the rest of the world. In A Deadly Covenant, while digging a trench for a new water project, a backhoe operator unearths the skeleton of a long-dead bushman. Kubu goes to investigate, expecting a cold case, but once he's there, the killing starts again. Our other presenter today is Bryony Rheam. Bryony lives in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe and is a past winner of the Write Your Own Christie competition. Her debut mystery is called All Come to Dust, and it introduces a young Bulawayo policeman, Chief Inspector Edmund Dube. A woman is found stabbed on the bed of her home, but it turns out she was already dead when that happened. Despite many false leads and opposition from his colleagues, Dube has to get to the bottom of a murder that wasn't. Christie would have approved of this one. Publishers Weekly chose it as one of 10 top African thrillers and called it a stunning debut. So to Agatha in Africa. Actually, it should really be called Agatha in Southern Africa, since she also visited North Africa. The story starts when Agatha and her husband Archie were invited by Major Belcher to join a promotional trip in 1922 to publicize the British Empire exhibition. They jumped at the opportunity to travel the world with all expenses paid. The tour involved South Africa and Southern Rhodesia, and Southern Africa clearly made a big impact on the Christies. Agatha subsequently wrote a novel using Southern Africa as the setting, titled The Man in the Brown Suit. It was published in 1924. Her protagonist, Anne Bedingfeld, witnesses a man die in the London Underground and follows clues to a steamer headed for Cape Town. She seizes the opportunity for adventure and books a passage on it, and an adventure she receives. The Man in the Brown Suit is a very enjoyable mystery thriller in what is now a historical setting. It's still well worth reading. At the time, the critical reception was mixed, but the Evening News paid her £500 to serialize it, and she used the money to buy her first motor car. She said it was one of the most exciting experiences of her life. Often Anne's voice seems to be Agatha's, speaking about her own experiences, and this is borne out by her letters from that time. Let's start as Agatha approaches Cape Town by sea. Stan will take up the story in Anne Bedingfeld's words from The Man in the Brown Suit.
Agatha and her husband Archie arrived in South Africa at Cape Town on the Kildoran Castle in early February 1922. Agatha describes their arrival through the words of Anne Bedingfeld, the protagonist of The Man in the Brown Suit. Quote, "I don't suppose that as long as I live I shall forget my first sight of Table Mountain. I got up frightfully early and went out on deck. I went right up to the boat deck, which I believe is a heinous offence, but I decided to dare something in the cause of solitude. We were just steaming into Table Bay. There were fleecy white clouds hovering above Table Mountain, and nestling on the slopes below, right down to the sea, was the sleeping town, gilded and bewitched by the morning sunlight. It made me catch my breath and have that curious, hungry pain inside that seizes one sometimes when one comes across something that's extra beautiful. I'm not very good at expressing these things, but I knew well enough that I had found, if only for a fleeting moment, the thing that I had been looking for ever since I left little Hampsley. Something new, something hitherto undreamed of, something that satisfied my aching hunger for romance. Close quotes. Agatha and the exhibition party stayed at the Mount Nelson Hotel, still a hotel today and a Cape Town landmark. But she and Archie really fell for surfing, which they learnt at Cape Town's Muizenberg Beach. They became quite passionate about it and were able to learn to surf standing up when they visited Hawaii later on the tour, apparently among the first English people to do so. It was a lifelong joy for her. Many years later she wrote, quote, "It was one of the most perfect physical pleasures that I've ever known." Close quote. This is what she said about her first attempts at Muizenberg, again in the words of Anne Bedingfeld. Quote, "Surfing looks perfectly easy. It isn't. I say no more. I got very angry and fairly hurled my plank from me. Nevertheless, I determined to return at the first possible opportunity and have another go. I would not be beaten. Quite by mistake, I then got a good run on my board and came out delirious with happiness. Surfing is like that. You are either vigorously cursing or else you are idiotically pleased with yourself." Close quotes. After South Africa, Archie and Agatha took the train to southern Rhodesia, as it was at the time. Bryony now takes up the story.
Agatha Christie and I go back a long way. When I was a child, my gran used to love her books. And so when I'd go to change her books on a Friday afternoon at the library, I would always pick up an Agatha Christie or two. And so it was, I became very familiar with a lot of the covers, especially those rather strange Fontana edition covers, and also a lot of the titles of her books. And as a family, also, we used to watch the Poirot series, the Miss Marple series together as a family, you know. And I remember things like a bit of a wrangle as to who was going to go and make the tea during the adverts because nobody wanted to miss when the program restarted. And we also went to see things like Evil Under the Sun and Murder on the Orient Express when they came to the cinema in Bulawayo. And I actually can't believe now that my mom would have taken us because I think some of them were actually quite frightening. I remember being really quite disturbed by Murder on the Orient Express. So Agatha Christie was somebody I came back to a bit later in life after reading a lot of good literature and I suppose more sort of highbrow stuff. I came back to reading her and I really enjoy her. I love the puzzle that is at the heart of each of her novels. And I was therefore really quite excited to discover that she'd actually been to Zimbabwe when it was Southern Rhodesia back in 1922. And that her trip here, she actually uses in her third novel, The Man in the Brown Suit. So I started doing some research and I found out some very fascinating similarities between Agatha Christie and the main character in The Man in the Brown Suit, Anne Bedingfeld. What had happened was that at the time in 1922, Agatha Christie had written a couple of novels, but she was nowhere near as well known as she would later to become. And in fact, she had written her second novel in order to try and raise enough money to save her beloved childhood home. So she wasn't as if she was, writing for the fame or necessarily writing to become an author, but using her writing as a way of making money for particular projects or ideas that she had in mind. And one night, Archie's old tutor from Clifton College came to dinner, and he said that he would like Archie to accompany him on a trip to the colonies to try and promote the Empire exhibition of 1924. He wanted Archie to travel as his financial advisor, and he said that Agatha could come along as well. Now, I think this was really an opportunity of a lifetime. Although the war was over, there was this awful gloom hanging over life in Europe in general. Archie had struggled to get a good job, a fulfilling job after being demobbed, and I think life was a little bit grim. So for someone to turn up and say, you know, would you like to come on a round the world trip, must have been quite an amazing thing. And Agatha hadn't traveled very widely at this point. You know, had done a couple of things, had obviously gone to Europe and to Egypt with her mother as a young lady before getting married, but she hadn't traveled very much at all. And so they thought about it, and although it meant that leaving their 2-year-old daughter behind for a whole year, they decided they were going to go. And strangely enough, what happened was that this Major Belcher challenged Agatha. He said that she could write a book in which he appeared as one of the main characters. And he also suggested that the murder be set at his house. And I think the original title of the book is Mystery at Mill House. So Agatha accepted this challenge, and Belcher is Sir Eustace Pedlar in The Man in the Brown Suit, who is quite a cantankerous old man, and that is apparently how Belcher was as well. And by the time the Christies arrived in Cape Town, which was their first stop, Agatha had totally enough of Belcher. So it's no wonder that he doesn't appear in a very good light in the novel. In The Man in the Brown Suit, Anne Bedingfeld is convinced that she has witnessed a murder, and it takes place in an underground station in London. And next to the body, she finds a note that says Kilmorden Castle, and it gives a date. And first of all, she thinks the Kilmorden Castle is a place, but it actually turns out to be a ship. And that ship is sailing to Cape Town. And that is obviously based on the Christie's trip on the Kilmorden Castle to Cape Town. Also along on the actual journey by ship, Agatha has a wonderful time. She meets lots of people, and some of those people also appear in The Man in the Brown Suit. So if you read her diaries, there's a lot of parallels between what she herself actually experienced and what Anne Bedingfeld experiences as well. So they get to South Africa and they have a wonderful time, and the idea is that they're then going up to Rhodesia. But whereas the South African government had paid all their travel expenses, paid for them to stay in hotels, the Southern Rhodesian government at first of all says they're not paying. And so there's a bit of a question, because, you know, for them to travel up by themselves is going to be very expensive. But eventually the Southern Rhodesian government give in, and they say they'll cover their expenses. So the Christies go off to Rhodesia by themselves, leaving Major Belcher in South Africa. So they go up by train, and they get to Bulawayo. Bulawayo is their first stop, and Agatha is not impressed with Bulawayo. She describes it as not very attractive, flat and sandy, and a dirty hotel full of smells. The hotel in question is the Grand Hotel in Bulawayo. This hotel, the original hotel which is the one that she would have stayed in, actually burnt down, and a replacement Grand Hotel was built. I think it was in the 1960s. But anyway, she then goes on to Salisbury first, where she stays at the Meekles Hotel, which she really enjoys. She likes it there. So from Salisbury, they're back to Bulawayo. They're up at the Victoria Falls, and really, I think it's the Victoria Falls that she falls, completely in love with. She cannot believe this beautiful, magnificent, quite mysterious place as well. And in a letter to her mother, she writes, "It has been lovely here. I can't bear to leave. It's not just the falls themselves, although they are very wonderful, but the whole place. No road, only paths, just the hotel and primeval woods for miles and miles, stretching into blueness. A delightful hotel, long and low and white, with beautifully clean rooms and wired all over like a fine meat safe against malarial mosquitoes." And she also talks about walking through the rainforest with Archie and the mists parting and seeing this beautiful waterfall. Unfortunately, Victoria Falls is quite different today. Obviously, there's still the rainforest and that, but it's most definitely not the only hotel there. And there are roads and there's, the usual development. So it's quite lovely to think of it as it was back then, being the only place that, that's where the railroad was going up to the falls, and how fantastic that must have been, just this hotel at the end of the line. And the railway station is actually opposite the hotel, so you didn't actually, I suppose, really need to go anywhere else. You didn't need to walk very far. The train literally came to the hotel. And Anne Bedingfield as well, she also loves Victoria Falls. She describes the place in very similar language to Agatha Christie in her letter to her mother. She thinks it's lovely, it's magnificent, and of course it's also very romantic as well. And it's here that she falls in love with a certain rather attractive colonial. And but it's also here where somebody tries to push her over the cataract one night when she walks down to the falls. So mixture of mystery and romance. And I think this must have been for readers at that time. This really must have been quite exciting. I think the idea of the colonies and the person who went to the colonies was really quite an exciting idea. So that the type of person who went off to look for a gold mine, or find diamonds, establish a fortune out in Africa. I think it really, that idea had a hold over people, especially when you consider that post-war life, which was quite gloomy and quite restricted as well. I think this idea of this wild Africa was really quite an exciting one. And anyway, then while they're there in Victoria Falls, Agatha and Archie receive a telegram from Major Belcher saying that they need to return to Cape Town as soon as possible. And so they do, and off they go. And unfortunately, once they've left Rhodesia, they then leave South Africa, and they go, they carry on their trip around the world. But it really is quite interesting to see how Agatha uses her experience, her own private experience, which really must have been quite exciting. That although she was married, although she wasn't traveling alone, this was totally new territory at a time when not many people had traveled, and the world really was quite an exciting place. I think we need to appreciate that today when we can just hop on a plane and go anywhere. We need to appreciate how big a deal it was to go off on a trip around the world, and to go to places like southern Rhodesia, which many people hadn't been to. How exciting and how adventurous that was. Um, so it all comes out in The Man in the Brown Suit, and I must admit, it's probably not one of her best novels. Um, it's a little bit too it's a little bit too convenient sometimes, and Adam Benningfield seems to sort of jump around Southern Africa, move around with amazing speed, at a time when it was actually quite expensive to travel. But at the same time, what I think is nice is that we see elements of Agatha Christie in Anne. Some people apparently criticized her for not using Hercule Poirot as her detective, but I actually think it's wonderful. We're seeing Agatha in Anne, and I think that's lovely. And yeah, that's what makes it one of my favorite Agatha Christie novels.
Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed joining Agatha on her trip through Southern Africa. If you have any questions or comments, we'd be delighted to hear from you, and we'll certainly get back to you with our responses. Following this, you'll see our websites and other social media contacts. Thanks again, and goodbye.